This video is all about cellular transport. How do your cells get things into and out of them? So a cell is like a miniature organism. Some organisms are only one cell big, but even the cells in your body, they have to figure out a way to get things in and out. So they require nutrients and oxygen, and in the process of breaking down those nutrients, they're going to be producing some waste products too. So there has to be a way to get things in and things out. The cell actually has three different ways of doing that: diffusion and osmosis, and active transport. Diffusion is any time molecules move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, no energy required. So I want you to imagine that you're standing on the top of a hill and you are on your bicycle, skateboard, roller skates, something like that, and you want to get to the bottom of the hill. There's not a lot of energy required for you to move from the top to the bottom of the hill. You're going from high to low, and all you have to do is glide down the hill. No energy required. In a cell, or in diffusion in general, molecules are always going to move from high to low concentration, just like you're going to move from the top of the hill to the bottom of the hill, from high to low. They move from where there's a lot of them to where there's not a lot of them. So they move from where there's a lot to where there's not. Anytime there is a difference in concentration, diffusion will happen. It will always go from high to low concentration. So if you imagine that you had a cup of water, and you can actually do this if you have a cup of water and food coloring at your house, if you get a cup of water and you drop some food dye right here just in one spot without you adding any energy, so no stirring, no swishing, nothing like that, those molecules will eventually spread out over time because they're bumping into all the other molecules of water that are in the cup until they're spread out everywhere, which is called equilibrium. Even at room temperature, these molecules are going so fast that they have enough energy that they're moving 1,400 miles an hour. That's at room temperature water. So you could actually try this experiment 3 times, once with room temperature water, once with cold water, and once with warm or hot water, and see how fast it takes for that kinetic energy of those molecules moving around and bumping into each other to actually spread out or to diffuse those food dye molecules all over. So this is an example of diffusion when we're not talking about cells. If you start to talk about cells, then it works a tiny bit differently, but it's the same idea. So when we're trying to move something across a cell membrane, the same sort of thing can happen as long as the cell allows that substance to be moved freely across the cell membrane. Remember, cell membranes are like the gatekeeper. They only allow some things to move in or move out, and they're called selectively or semi-permeable. So the way that the cell does this, the way it controls what comes into and out of the cell, is because there's tiny little holes or pores in the cell membrane. It's made up of a double layer of fat cells called phospholipids. This phospholipid bilayer forms these teeny tiny holes all through the cell membrane. And then, if they need to move things that are a little bit bigger, they also have larger molecules called transport proteins that are within that cell membrane that can make bigger holes or pores. So this is kind of what it looks like. If we could look at all of the different parts of a phospholipid, which is made up of phosphates and fats, this is what it would look like. It has a little head. There's a more generalized version, and it has 2 tails or arms. So if we lined all of those up next to each other, they would be head to head, and then all the arms, and then the other layer would be on the other side, head to head, arm to arm, and that's how the cell membrane is made up of in your body. So this is inside your cell. This is outside your cell. And then these big channels are called transport proteins. They can allow bigger substances in and out. So what does that actually mean, and how does it actually work? Well, some things can pass freely in and out of the cell right through these teeny tiny holes of the cell membrane because they are usually small, they usually don't have a charge, they're able to be dissolved in water. There's a whole bunch of different things that determine whether or not the cell will let those things pass in and out. But if they do, then we can just use simple diffusion to make that happen. So now imagine in your cup of water, instead of just a plain open cup, you had something like a cell membrane that went right down through the middle of it. This semi-permeable membrane will allow small and nonpolar or non-charged molecules like water or food dye to pass easily and freely back and forth from side to side. So water will go to the right and to the left. So will the food dye. Because of all that bumping around and pushing into each other, after a period of time, the water and the food dye will be evenly distributed on both sides of that membrane, and now equilibrium has been reached. An example in your body of this happening is through your lungs and your blood. So inside your lungs, you have these teeny tiny air sacs called alveoli. They are surrounded by cells that have little holes in them, and then they're surrounded by blood vessels that are also made up of cells that have little holes in them. Remember, your blood is carrying carbon dioxide-rich blood to your lungs, and because there's more carbon dioxide in your blood, it will automatically move from where there's a lot to where there's not. So the carbon dioxide will move from high concentration in your blood to low concentration in your lungs, and then you can breathe out that carbon dioxide and take in fresh air. And at the same time, all of this fresh air in your lungs has a lot of oxygen in it. And because your blood is passing by with very little oxygen, the oxygen will move from where there's a lot to where there's not. So as your blood flows past your lungs, automatically CO2 will hop off and oxygen will hop into your blood. So that's how that oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange happens in your lungs. And it's through simple diffusion because CO2 and oxygen are really small and they can move freely back and forth across the cell membrane. So again, let's say that we have a mix of CO2 and oxygen up here. There's more at the top than there is at the bottom, so it will move right through those pores from where there's high concentration to low concentration until it's equally balanced on both sides of the cell. All right, facilitated diffusion is very similar. The only difference is that it requires a transport protein to move substances like sugars or amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins, from high concentration to low concentration. It just can't pass freely through those little tiny holes, so it has to go through a protein channel. No energy required. So I'm going to give you an example of a screen door. Imagine that you have a screen door, and these are all the little holes in the screen. So easily pass right through there is air. We want our screens to be able to let air freely in and out of our houses, and we don't want to worry about things like bugs or animals getting in or leaving. So we have the screen door right there where the screen is closed, but the door is open. So air and oxygen can freely pass in and out, but other things can't. Now imagine that you have a dog, and your dog needs to go outside, and he would like to go freely in and out of the screen door, but he's too big to fit. So instead, you install a doggy door for your dog right here. This doggy door will let your big dog move freely in and out of the screen without damaging the screen and without having you to get up and require any energy to let him in or out. So that doggy door is really helpful because even though he's bigger, he still gets to come in and out freely, and we don't want to have to pay any energy of our own to do it. So he can go through the doggy door or the protein channel. In your body, this would be glucose. Glucose is too big to fit through the pores in your cell membrane, so it has to be helped or facilitated through this protein channel. It's still going to move from high to low concentration, and it's still going to move where it needs to go. The interesting thing about glucose, which we'll talk about soon, is that glucose actually requires a little key to open up this protein channel and allow it to move freely in and out. All right, so that's diffusion and facilitated diffusion. Osmosis is just a kind of diffusion, but it only involves water molecules. Water molecules are really small. They can move in and out of your cell membrane very, very freely. No energy required. They go from high concentration of water to low concentration of water. Now, it's almost the same thing as regular diffusion, but in reality, it actually looks quite a lot different. But it's really just the diffusion of water. So water will move from where there's a lot of high concentration to where there's not, low concentration, right through that cell membrane. Here's why it looks different in real life. So let's imagine that instead of food dye, we have this situation up here. The water molecules are the little tiny black dots. And let's say that this is salt or sugar. I'm going to say it's salt, okay? The salt cannot freely move back and forth across the cell membrane. So if it could, it would move from where there's a lot of salt to where there's not a lot of salt until it was balanced evenly. But it is stuck. It can't move. It's too big. And there's no transport proteins to help move that process through. So because the salt can't move, the water will move. The water will move from where there's a lot of water over here on the left to where there's not a lot of water over here on the right. So that water will move back and forth until eventually we have an equal concentration of salt to water on both sides of the cell membrane. Why is this different? Because the fluid levels aren't balanced anymore. The water has moved from where there's a lot of water to where there's not a lot of water, and along the way it has changed the levels of fluid that are there. But now the concentrations are the same. There's an equal percentage of salt to water molecules on both sides of the cell membrane. So it's now has reached equilibrium of concentration, but the water levels are different. And this is going to be a big deal when we're starting to talk about how our cells behave in watery and salty environments, things like that. I'm going to skip that and move on to this one because I think it shows it a little bit better. And the way that I like to remember osmosis is that salt sucks, okay? Salt can't move. It's stuck where it is. So it doesn't diffuse across the cell membrane. So if it could, remember, salt is the big purple molecules, and then we have water, that is all the rest of it. If the salt could move, it would move from where there's a lot to where there's not, but it's stuck. So instead, because it's stuck, it sucks. Okay? The salt is going to suck the water in the direction of more salt. It will literally pull the water along or suck it across the cell membrane. So now this salt has sucked this water across the cell membrane, and now the concentrations are equal on both sides. How does this work in real life? Okay, well, our cells like to be in what we call an isotonic solution. That means it has about the same amount of salts and stuff on the inside of the cell as on the outside of the cell. So our cells are happy when they're in this solution because it means that there's not a lot of water movement being coming in or coming out. If you placed your cells, these fresh, nice red blood cells, into a salt solution like salt water, all of that salt water on the outside of the cells is going to suck or pull all of the water out of your cells. The cells will get really dehydrated, they'll shrink and they'll shrivel and they will die. That's why we can't drink salt water. If you were stranded in the ocean, you couldn't drink salt water. It would dehydrate you faster than drinking no water at all. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, if we put our cells in pure distilled water with zero salt, which is the kind of water we should drink, it's good because it will help balance out the concentration. But if you have too much water, and that actually is the thing that can happen if you drink too much water, then that water will be pulled into your cells, sucked into your cells by all the salts and other dissolved substances. They'll get so much water inside that they could burst and die as well. Okay, remember, osmosis is just a form of passive transport or diffusion, so it doesn't require any energy. It just looks a little bit different. Moving on into the kind of transport that requires energy. So I want you to think of a couple of different scenarios. So first of all, now instead of being at the top of the hill, we're at the bottom of the hill with our rollerblades or a bicycle or a skateboard, and we got to get to the top. So we got to go from low to high concentration. That is going to require a lot of energy. And the reason why this happens in your cells is because they want to move molecules from low to high concentration, the opposite of diffusion. So there's already some salt or starch or sugar in the cell, but it wants more. So it's going to have to pull them in, and it's going to require energy for that to happen. The other example is the thing that it wants in or out is way too big to fit through the cell membrane pores or even a protein. So it's literally going to have to take in or give out that substance through a different process. Both of these examples are active transport. Active transport requires energy, And our energy currency in our body that we use is called ATP. All right, so let's say that I have starches in my cell down here. And so there's a high concentration of starches down here, low concentration of starches up here. Normally with diffusion, it would move it from high to low concentration, but my cell actually wants more. So it's going to move the starch from low to high concentration. In order to do that, it's going to use what we call an active transport protein pump. And it will require it to pay a little fee or a fine of energy in order to move that starch into the cell. So basically, as it pays that energy, it will pull that starch down and through into the cell membrane. Okay? Another example is called endocytosis. So imagine that your cell needs something that's really, really big. It's going to take in a large particle, and it can't fit through the cell membrane. So it basically wraps part of the cell membrane around it and pinches it off like a little vesicle and takes it inside so that it can be broken down inside the cell. So it basically engulfs it and pulls it in. The opposite of that is called exocytosis. It wants to get rid of something really big. So it takes this large vesicle full of stuff, moves it to the outside of the cell membrane, and kind of erps it up, or burps or vomits it up right outside the cell membrane. Okay? So to review, we have different examples of passive and active transport. So to review, we have passive and active transport. The two kinds of passive transport we have are diffusion, including osmosis, which moves small molecules across the cell membrane. Then we have facilitated diffusion, still no energy required, but those larger molecules have to go through a transport protein. This is your dog coming in through that doggy door. Then we have active transport. Active transport could be because we want to move molecules from low to high concentration. We have some, but we want even more. So we have to pay a fine or a fee of energy to get those molecules across. Active transport also includes endo and exocytosis, that taking in or giving up of really big molecules that can't fit through the cell membrane or a protein. So again, I want you to remember the analogy of standing high up on that hill with your bike or your skateboard, and you want to go from high to low concentration. No energy required. That's what diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion are like. Active transport is when you're at the bottom of the hill and you need to climb or ride all the way to the top. You're going from low to high. You need to require it. It requires a lot of energy, and it's going to be hard work. And so that's why that energy is required to move substances from low to high concentration. Another analogy is a castle. So if you are in a castle and you need to move something into or out of that castle, the castle would be your cell, that I just move something freely back and forth, it's going to be like diffusion or osmosis. So I can move something easily in and out of the castle right past the gatekeeper. I don't have to pay a fee. He just lets me go in and out. Okay? If I want to move something that's a little bit too big, or I want more of something, then I might have to pay a fee to that gatekeeper so that he can say, we already have enough of that here, we don't need any more. And you're like, but I want it in there. So you have to pay him a fine or a fee to get it in. Or maybe that thing you have is so big that you have to break down part of the gate or even catapult the object over the gate. That would be like endo or exocytosis to get that really big thing in or out, and that's going to require a lot of energy.